So you've been great so far. I'm really glad everybody's, seems to be following along, seems to be hanging in there. This last step, group analysis, is usually what we're interested in. And, an extension of this is ROI analysis, which we would talk about first part of tomorrow. I want just to give you a heads up. I am recording all of these. These will be available probably within a week. I'll put it in a playlist. It'll be publicly available. And, if you want to review this, start to work on your own data sets, start to work with your own on computer. I hope it's useful. I hope it gives you enough to start to do that on your own. Okay, no need to really go over all of this. We covered everything we were going to so far: preprocessing, GLM, AFNI viewer, and now first level analysis. So, group level analysis now, ROI analysis tomorrow. So a preview, we have a couple of different ways to do our ROI analysis. We'll be talking about atlases, some defaults that come with AFNI, and a command called 3D undump to create a sphere if you want to do a spherical ROI analysis. Just a little sneak preview. With group level analysis, AFNI can perform either a random effects or random effects or mixed effects analysis. Random effects meaning we're trying to adequately model variance, assuming that we took a random sample of subjects from a group. Because the goal of all this is to try to make some inference about the group that we drew all these people from. So if I have a group of, randomly selected college students, typically our sample, can we generalize this to every single human being in the world? Probably not, but we try to make the case that we can. In any case, we try to say that because it's a random sample from the population, we should be able to make some inference about the population that it came from. And we need to model the variance in a specific way to try to best reflect that. With the mixed effects analysis, we are trying to account for variance both within the subjects and also between the subjects. So if there's a subject that had a lot of variability in a certain beta weight estimate, we weight that person less than we would with somebody who has a very precise or an estimate that doesn't vary very much. Yeah. So you can do that a couple different ways, 3D LME or 3D MIMA. 3D LME requires an R package installation, so I'm not going to cover it. It does something similar to 3D MIMA, which we're going to run today, which accounts for individual subject variability and passes that on to group level analysis. Yeah, so fixed effects is something you may also come across. If you were only interested in that sample that you collected and you want to make some sort of claim about whether their effect was significant, you could if you used fixed effects, but you can't make an inference to the group that they came from. So is it useful? Probably not, at least for research purposes. For a case study, they usually do that, though. If it's a small sample and you're only interested in that sample, that's totally valid. But random effects need to estimate the population variance so that you can do an appropriate group inference. So mixed effects combines both first level magnitude and variance, and it requires this thing called a REML fit to have been run. With that Uber subject script, I did choose to run it. I recommend everybody runs it because it doesn't take that long, and it gives you another option for how you can look at your data. And it's pretty easy to use, and really the idea behind it is simple. I've already said it a few times. If we can model each subject's variability, can we get a better estimate of the actual group parameter? Because I could have somebody who's not necessarily an outlier. It's not like they were moving too much or they had a problem or they weren't doing the task correctly. But there's just a lot of variability in their data for whatever reason. They're just noisier than the other ones. And it stands to reason that if there's a lot of variability in that particular subject, maybe they shouldn't have as much weight as somebody who doesn't have so much variability. Somebody may come back and say, well, variability can be something of interest. I'm not going to argue that point. Some people do look at that, and they look at it through things like, say, beta series correlation is a pretty good example of that, because you're looking at the response to each individual trial instead of averaging across all of it and tossing out some of the variance. In any case, to give you a brief example what the differences between them, notice that at a single subject level, the patterns of, this might be a group, no, this is a group level map, sorry. I did it with 3D t-test, 3D MIMA. I think this might have been for the congruent. I just kind of picked a beta map at random. But you'll notice that the actual beta, the peak beta in this case, somewhere around in this area, was 0.76. The t-stat was 7.57. With 3D MIMA, the actual magnitude of the effect is slightly smaller, but notice that the t-statistic is greater. Okay, suggesting that it's what the argument is 3D MIMA tends to control for inflated effect sizes, right? And it also gives you a slightly higher t-statistic because you're controlling for an additional source of variability. A lot of people, well, the AFNI people, consider 3D MIMA to be superior to 3D t-test. In my experience, the gains are, they're moderate, but they are consistent, Something like a 0.4, 0.5 increase in the t-statistic is pretty considerable, right? It's no joke. I haven't run it on enough data sets to see whether it's consistently superior in my experience, but theoretically it seems to make sense, and I don't see why people wouldn't use it. If anybody disagrees, feel free to speak up. But,
do you think 3D MIMA would be comparable or better than if you were running 3D and a repeated measures ANOVA?
Compared to a repeated measures ANOVA? Well, 3D MIMA can also, I believe, be used with the results from an ANOVA. I think. I'm pretty sure I read that in the manual. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I've never.
So it's complementary. It's not. It doesn't displace ANOVAs or any of those more advanced statistical models. What should I say about this? This looks similar to that Uber subject script, right? There's another Uber script called Uber t-test. You'll have the output of the script generated by this in the group analysis directory, which should be in your flanker directory. We'll look at that in a little bit. The major thing I want to point out, so you can choose either 3D t-test or 3D MIMA to use. If you select 3D MIMA, it requires not only the beta coefficient right here, but also the t-stat as well, right? Because the t-stat contains information about the variability at the single subject level. What people used to do, and people still do, it's very common, is you get a single beta or parameter estimate at each voxel and for each subject. Typically, what people have done is they take that beta value and they just submit that to a higher level group analysis. So whatever the t-statistic was associated with that, whatever the variability was going to the beta estimate, doesn't matter, they just totally ignore that. Now, that's just the way it's been done for a long time, but as we become a little bit more sophisticated with our analyses, with our computational power, we have the ability to model it, and it really doesn't impose that much of an additional cost. At this point, I really don't even notice the difference that much. But in this case, you do need to provide both the coefficient and also the t-statistic if you were using the Uber t-test.
So would it only submit the ones that are significant to?
No, not necessarily. It's not only going to submit the ones that are significant. It's simply going to include the information about the individual subject's T statistic at each voxel. When it then goes to a group level and then does the both the calculating the beta weight at the group level and also the T statistic estimate. Yeah. So as opposed to like a simple, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm not going to get into that right now. You have to wait. A few words just about t-tests, f-tests. Again, I don't find f-tests that useful. I can't think of, no example comes to mind readily about using the f-test. But the t-test, simply stated, is the magnitude significant, accounting for the variability in the estimate. If you were to run an f-test, you are testing for whether any of these individual t-tests are significant. So if you've ever seen a contrast vector, they're like a series of ones and zeros, right? So you may have like a 1 here testing for whether this particular regressor is significant, then 0 for everything else. An f-test would be like a series of contrast vectors. Okay, as many as you want, really. But the f-test is basically, is this t-test or this t-test or this t-test or this t-test, depending on the number of t-tests, significant or not? So that resulting map, how do you interpret it? I've never found a really good use for it. Because if I'm looking at something like an interaction, it's easier to break that down into the individual components and then extract that with an ROI analysis and run some kind of interaction with it. Because then you can actually see what's driving the effect, which I think is much more useful. But the default f-test in AFNI is the omnibus test, which we looked at. And as I also showed you when we looked at the proc script, t-test can be specified with the GLT sim option in 3D deconvolve or uber subject if you get to that. Oof. Okay, going through a lot here. Remember I talked about, we could look at incongruent, congruent individually. But what you can also do is simply take the contrast between them and then submit that to a second level analysis. That's called a summary statistics approach. The SPM guys love it. They've been doing it for a long time. And it does make sense at a certain level. So at a group level, you could do a paired t-test between, say, incongruent, congruent, or you could simply do a one-sample t-test on the contrast of incongruent, congruent, and you should get roughly the same thing. It's considered appropriate as long as within session covariance is roughly equal across the subjects. So how do you test for that? At what point does it become a problem? I can't give you a hard threshold. But in general, this thing does seem to hold. So if you want to do that approach compared to a paired t-test, I consider that totally acceptable unless one of your subjects seems to be a really clear outlier. If you found one that had, within this ROI you're looking at, their contrast or their individual parts of the contrast are really far away from everybody else, I would reconsider doing that.
So in that case, would you do just the one sample t-test at the individual level and do the paired t-test at the group level?
It's not so much doing a one sample t-test at the individual level. It's just doing a paired t-test at the group level. Yeah, estimating the betas separately for each condition and then doing a paired t-test. Okay. Does everybody want to hear about Eklund a little bit? Do you want to hear about that? Okay. I try not to give this guy a hard time. I really don't. It's hard for me not to. I know this is being recorded, but whatever. He's like he watches anything that I put up there. Okay, you may have come across this. This came out a couple of years ago, 2016, by Eklund, Nichols, and Knudsen. It was called cluster failure, why fMRI inferences have inflated false positive rates. Now, in their significant statement, they said we found that most common software packages use certain methods that can have false positive rates of up to 70%. These results question the validity of some 40,000 fMRI studies, which is basically every fMRI study that's been published. But the media that picked it up, they were very even-handed in their discussion of this. That's a joke. Okay, people. Of course there weren't. Come on. Okay, so in places like The Economist, other things are like, fMRI, the field is completely corrupt, and we're all screwed. Everything we've learned has been wrong. I mean, they later retracted this and said, whoa, we didn't actually mean that. But I kind of called BS on that, I think. I don't know. Anyway, this was a big deal, okay? So it brought a lot of attention to neuroimaging. It made taxpayers think, why are we giving these people so much money to do studies? But at the same time, it did bring up a real problem. Not for everybody, not for every possible experiment, but for a good number of them. And for a subset of them, it truly could lead to inflated false positives. So I'm not arguing with their methodology, but the presentation had something lacking, in my opinion. Now, because so many studies use cluster extent thresholding, about 75%, this is something that we really need to take seriously. Now, Eklund pointed out a couple of things. One, this whole concept of smoothness, this whole concept of introducing spatial autocorrelations between adjacent voxels, it varies over the brain, which was not really taken that seriously before. So particularly, I think in regions like MPFC, some PCC, basically like default mode network type areas, the smoothness is a lot bigger than it is in other regions. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two is the way that the smoothness was usually being modeled is with a Gaussian function. Okay, so let's make sure I'm doing the right one here. Okay, so what they used to assume, if we're looking at the correlation between, say, one voxel and its neighboring voxels, so as you go farther and farther in distance, the amount of, let's say, shared variance between that voxel and its neighbors tends to taper off, right? Not surprising. A voxel right next to another voxel is going to look very similar in its spatial and temporal profile. But what he found is that it's actually better modeled with another kind of function, not a Gaussian function, but a mixture of a Gaussian and an exponential function, which has a thicker tail. So there's actually more correlation than we're giving voxels credit for. Why this is a big problem is because when we do a cluster correction, right? I talked about the Bonferroni, individual voxel correction, which people think was too conservative. So the alternative, which is much more popular, is a cluster correction threshold. And that is where I have, let's say I have 10 voxels that are all contiguous. They all border each other. And these voxels each pass on their own an individual threshold of 0.01. What's the probability, just due to chance, I'm going to see 10 voxels contiguously passing that threshold individually? That individual threshold is called a cluster-forming threshold. Cluster-forming threshold. What else do I want to say about that? We then can run simulations on a noise data set that has the same smoothness properties, the same voxel sizes, same dimensions as the data we're using for group level analysis. And then we see in that simulated data set what percentage of the time do we see clusters of a certain size passing that cluster forming threshold, and at how large of a cluster. Right? So we're doing the same thing we do with all these null distribution tests, where we create a distribution, and we say, okay, 5% of the time, just due to chance, I'm going to see a cluster of this size or bigger that all pass, like individually pass this cluster forming threshold. Yeah. I wish I had a good animation to show that. I'm still working on it, but I don't have anything to show that, so I'm just waving my hands around. But does that make sense what's happening? Okay. So the key word there is, assuming that, this data has this kind of smoothness, because we know that smoothness is probably going to bias you into getting clusters of a certain size, right? But if we don't have that right, if we assume that there's, not very much correlation between this voxel and voxels way out here, but in fact, there actually is a fair amount of correlation between this voxel and a voxel, 15 millimeters away, we're going to be, let me make sure I get this right. We are going to say that clusters, we're going to let clusters that are relatively small, we're going to say that those are significant when actually, according to an appropriate simulation, they really shouldn't be passing this 0.05 threshold.
Because they have so much correlation between them?
Yeah, because it shouldn't be surprising if there's a lot of correlation to find, relatively large clusters. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this was the graph that made them famous, I guess. This is one of them. I'm not showing all of them, but here are the false positive rates, and this is for a cluster defining threshold of 0.01 across a bunch of the different packages. Looking at 3D test, 3D MIMA, SPM, a couple of FSL things. And then their favorite is this permutation test, which doesn't have parametric assumptions. It's a non-parametric test. It's basically swapping. Let me make sure I'm getting this right. Just for now, let's say it's a non-parametric test. I'm gonna trip up on it. But this is the one that they're recommending because no matter what you do to it, no matter what kind of cluster forming threshold you have, it seems to follow the nominal 0.05 error rate. And that was their point. If you use a cluster defining threshold of 0.001, which is a little bit more conservative, but remember that's just individually within the cluster, the threshold for each individual voxel. If you use that for something like 3D t-test, you're actually a lot closer to this true 0.05 threshold. So their problem was with studies using a parametric method and using a cluster defining threshold of 0.01 or more liberal, yeah, like 0.05, let's say. Okay, so what to do about it? Well, they pointed out a bug in an earlier version of 3D full with half max. It's since been corrected, and now AFNI defaults to output these so-called autocorrelation function, or HCF parameters, showing you the mixture of Gaussian and exponential distributions to more correctly model the smoothness function. So it's more appropriate when you run this 3D plus sim thing. All right, so it works best with the p less than 0.001 voxel-wise threshold. You can use something like 0.01 cluster defining threshold, 0.05, but the clusters can become very big very quickly. So anything that you want to determine is statistically significant can become so big that it's almost spatially meaningless because it spans so many different regions. So 0.001 is really what is recommended these days. Oh man, I'm running out of time here. Are we getting kicked out of this room at a certain point? No. I'm trying to respect people's time. I know that people do need to go at some point. I just have a few more slides. I was going to say they're really cool, but they're like maybe for us. I'm not sure. Eklund strikes again with another paper. You just can't let this thing go. He's pointing out data preprocessing has a large effect on false positives. So he's recommending to use something like FSL's independent components analysis to identify things like physiological and motion artifacts to clean up the data before you do anything further with it. And if you do that, you tend to reduce the spatial distribution of false clusters. So in this case, it's highest within, this is the front of the brain, this is the prefrontal cortex, posterior. It tends to reduce it quite a bit if you use some of FSL's pre-processing mechanisms. So that's another argument why you should be familiar with different packages if you want to use certain tools from them. Okay, so what we'll be looking at is the group level maps. And we want to say, is this cluster significant? Let's say, this cluster right here, is this truly a significant cluster? So we need to run 3D full width half max on the residuals of the data. Because remember, we want to run this on basically a simulation data set similar to our real data set, but we're doing this on what we effectively think is the noise. So we're trying to generate from this noise data set clusters that are of a certain extent and passing a certain cluster defining threshold. This is a typical command. You give it a mask to restrict your analysis to only those boxes you care about. You give it the error time series. Okay, it could be from the REML, or it could be from without doing the REML fit. If you give this ACF flag, you get a few different numbers here. These are the numbers you feed into your cluster simulation. Okay, this represents the mixture of Gaussian to exponential, so it's about 82% Gaussian distribution and 18% exponential distribution. I'm not actually sure what these two numbers mean, but this last one is then the effective smoothness in your data, accounting for both the applied smoothness and the inherent smoothness. Once we do that, oops.
So that was saying essentially like there was a 7 millimeter smoothness on something that we applied a 4 millimeter smoothness to?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, in this data set we applied 4 millimeter smoothness, but the effective smoothness is 7 millimeters. Remember I brought up a point. There is a way to restrict the smoothness, to put an upper bound on it. Or you only want to smooth up to, say, whatever number you specify. So if I said only smooth to 6 millimeters, it would only go to 6 millimeters and not 7 or 8.
What point was that?
What's that?
Putting the upper bound at what point in this?
It's whatever you want it to be.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry. At what point in the processing stream?
Oh,
so like the smooth.
yeah, that's during the smoothing step.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, a lot of options, and unfortunately we can't get into all of them, but they are there. Now, last thing we need to do, feed those ACF parameters into 3D CLUSIM. Looks something like this. So these are the numbers from before, the previous slide. And then we give it our alpha threshold, which is determining whether the cluster is significant at a 0.05 level. And then the cluster defining threshold, which I'm going to say is 0.001. You'll see something like this. So the cluster defining threshold 0.001. It's going to be, we'll see clusters of size 9 or greater, 5% or less of the time is what this is saying. You get a lot of different output because it's going to do this for things called nearest neighbor 2, nearest neighbor 3. That is, if I recall correctly, NN2 is whether the entire edge of a voxel is touching another voxel. NN3 is whether an entire face is touching another voxel. Right? Now, typically you shouldn't see a lot of variation between the different NN options. Maybe a little bit, but it's not huge. Okay, so in this case, if I want to be safe, I would set my threshold for only a cluster of 10 voxels or greater.
So that's saying only a cluster of 10 voxels or greater is unlikely
Yes.
to be significant by chance?
Exactly,
Okay.
yes. Because according to our simulations, we only see that 5% or less of the time. It runs, I forget how many thousand simulations, but it's quite a bit, and it builds up this distribution of what's going on. Then lastly, okay, excuse me, we're going to use clusterize to threshold the brain to only see clusters above a certain threshold. Then we get a table like this, showing us the size of these clusters, where they are. You can jump to them, see how big they are, and then basically you determine that that is a statistically significant cluster, which we will walk through in just a second. Okay. All right, so let's do a few things here. We're going to look at both the output from 3D t-test and 3D MIMA. We're going to try, let's see, should we do it? This was when I was using Uber t-test, so probably not do that one. We will explore different cluster forming thresholds and then test for significance using 3D Clust Sim. So, open up your terminal, go to the flanker directory. Okay, so within group results, first go into test 001 3D t-test ++. And within that, you'll see a few things. There's incongruent minus congruent t-test. There's some outputs just showing what the output of the command was. And then the actual results and test results. Now, don't follow along with this. I just want to show you something to illustrate. Within each subject's results directory, remember we had these, statistical data sets. I'm going to use the command 3D info verb to look within the stats sub 01 data set. So there's quite a bit of output. What I'm focusing on here is you'll see that each sub-RIC is a different statistical parameter that was estimated. So there's the full F-test. There was the beta coefficient for congruent t-tests. Not sure really what the F-stat's doing there, but incongruence as well. And then we also had the contrast estimates for the t-tests. The one I'm particularly interested in is sub-RIC 7, which is the coefficient for incongruent minus congruent. Now, you're still in that same data set. Let's take a brief look at, oops. So in group results, test 01, 3D t-test. If you type cat incongruent minus congruent t-test, you see the script that was used to run this t-test. Now, all it did was within each subject's directory, and I created this through Uber t-test.py, which is pretty straightforward to use. It's doing a sub-RIC selector within these brackets. This is the syntax. So at the very end of the statistical data set, in brackets, you specify the coefficient you want to do a test on. In this case, number 7 corresponds to the coefficient, and we have one line per subject. So basically, at every voxel, it's going to take this coefficient estimate for each subject and do a t-test on it. Pretty simple. So don't think about the whole brain. Just think about a single voxel and how you're going to have, we have 26 subjects. We're going to have 26 numbers. And you're going to see the magnitude, which is the average across all of these people, and also the t-test, the t-statistic. Let's take a look at what that looks like, and then I'll show you how to modify the script to test different sub-RICs. So within this, we have test.results. And what you're going to find useful is if you type CP, let's see here, dot dot slash dot dot slash, no, one more dot dot slash MNI asterisk, and then a dot to represent the current directory. So you're copying that template to the current directory because now we're going to look at our group results on a template brain. Okay, we're good? We're good. All right, so if that is within your test results directory, type AFNI to then open it up. And as before, we have an underlay. The default is going to now be this It should be, so your underlay, you should set it to the M&I average. Yeah? And then overlay, incongruent minus congruent t-test. All right. What I prefer, so for the overlay drop-down menu, set that to mean so that I can see what the actual group average estimate is of that particular voxel. And then I'm going to set this to, let's say, a p threshold of 0.001. Now notice at that threshold there are very, very few clusters remaining. So just to review, I click on this, left click, hold it down, go to set p-value, and then you can set a p-value of 0.001. Very good, are we seeing it? Okay, so this is a thresholded group level map, right? Now, we have some clusters here, but how do we determine whether this cluster is of a size that actually passes significance? Right? We're going to come back to this. Now, leave this as it is. Right? Let's see, if you go back to your terminal and you just press Enter, you're going to have command of the terminal. The AFNI windows should be open, and we're going to come back to that in a second. Just going to leave that open for now. Okay. So you can do that, right? If you hit Enter, it's going to still be running in the background. Excellent. Okay, so what we want to do is go into a single subject directory, and we are going to estimate what the actual smoothness is and use that for a cluster simulation. So type cd dot slash dot dot, we get back to our original flanker directory, and I'm going to go into sub 01 and then sub 01 results. Notice this is a little bit more advanced. I'm not going into just one directory, ls, then going into another directory. I'm familiar enough with the directory structure to go into 2 consecutive directories, okay? Now, once we are there, remember, we're going to estimate the smoothness from the error time series. I'm just going to do this for one subject and use that as, a good enough estimate for my data set. So here's AirTS sub 01. This is what I used for my 3D t-test. We also have, REML for 3D MIMA. That's a little bit separate. Okay. And also remember, we need to supply a mask. The one that I like to use is called mask_group. So keep these 2 things in mind. If I go back to my PowerPoint, the command is going to look something like this. So 3D 4th half max, we give it this mask_group. We also have the input, which is the error time series, and then this -ACF flag to estimate the autocorrelation function. So from that directory containing your error time series and all your subject results, it's going to look something like this. 3D 4th half max. Notice FWHM is capitalized, X is not. Mask _group plus TLRC. Then -input ERRTS dot sub 01 plus TLRC. That's my error time series. And then -ACF. If you press enter, it begins to estimate all this. Number of voxels in the mask, about 72,000. It's going to do a couple different ACF calculations, but at the end it's going to give you those parameters you need to do an accurate cluster simulation. Oh yeah. Oops. Command is right here. errts.sub01. Yeah. It'll take maybe 30 seconds to run. Yeah.
Explain again why you're running this on the error.
Right, because we're trying to do a cluster simulation on the noise. Right?
So when there technically isn't supposed to be anything in the data, how many times does it?
Right, yeah, this is our best estimate of what kind of like a noisy time series would look like. And we're going to be running the simulations on that. If we did it on, say the actual statistical data set, it's not going to look, it's going to have some structure to it.
So
We don't want that.
theoretically, if you didn't model like two of your conditions in 3D decompose, then this wouldn't be appropriate, right? Because your error-
Right, yeah, you want to model every possible source of variance.
Okay, so
And then anything left over. Yeah.
Your errors are just like
Mhm.
actual.
Yep.
Got it.
And so in actual practice, you wouldn't use just a single subject's worth of data, you would use the entire set.
Yes, yes. Yeah. If we were going to be systematic about this, we would be doing this for each subject individually. What they recommend is, or what Gang Chen recommends, the guy who designed this, would be to average across all the parameters that we get for each subject and then submit that to a cluster simulation. I'm just going to use one subject just for time's sake and assume that that's probably a good enough estimate. But
So
yeah.
you average the residuals from all subjects?
no, you'd be running this for each subject and then averaging these
Oh.
numbers right here. So again, these are my ACF results, and I'm going to use these with 3D Plus Sim.
Okay.
And just to refresh my memory, so we're going to use this command right here, 3D Plus Sim. Again, specify the mask, the ACF parameters, alpha threshold, and P threshold. If you wanted to, you could specify multiple alpha and P thresholds, but I'm just going to choose one because then I don't have to correct for looking at it at multiple levels. Okay, so from that same directory, 3D clust sim -ACF 0.82. Let's just use all the numbers. Why not? Let's use all of them. Okay, so I specify all those numbers, then I'm going to give it a mask data set, which is mask _ group plus TLRC. Then I am going to give it,
We should have the same numbers?
No.
it might be slightly different. So the exact numbers are going to be, they might be a little bit different in your case.
So you put the for second and third, right?
Yes.
Does it matter if the dash ACF or dash mask is first?
It shouldn't matter what the order of the options is. Yeah, your numbers may be slightly different, just so you know. Yeah. Let me see here. Then A threshold, P threshold. Right. Okay, then A thresh, again 0.05, it's going to be pretty constant across all studies. P threshold, again, I recommend about 0.001 to represent our cluster defining threshold for each individual voxel within that cluster. We all good? Okay, hit enter. Drop the bomb. And, okay, we wait a little bit. This has been a long day, guys. I want to say we're covering a lot of ground. Usually they spread this out over at least 2 or 3 days to do what we've done. So it's been quite a bit. We didn't have as much time for, doing some practical stuff on your own as I would have liked. But I'm hoping that this is giving you enough of a foundation to at least, say, interpret some results and to be able to look at some pre-processing. If you have any other questions or you want some more clarification, please, We're going to be getting dinner tomorrow, right? Okay, so you can ask me then. You can email me in the meantime.
There's that form too. You put on your website.
Yeah. I also want to point out that on the workshop website, on the agenda, at the very bottom, there's a link to a place for questions after the first day. So you can email those to me. It's totally anonymous. You can email me directly if you want, if you don't really care. And I'll answer those at the beginning of tomorrow. Right? Okay. Almost there, home stretch. So we get a ton of output. This is by default, and I haven't found a good way to restrict it. Keep scrolling up until you get to where the simulation just stopped. Yeah. Notice that it's giving you a bunch of different combinations for things like whether the voxels are touching, are they touching corners, edges, faces, and also is it one-sided or two-sided. If you look at something like, let's see here, NN1, and it's one-sided thresholding, it's going to recommend using a cluster size of, in this case, 9 or greater. If you get 8.6, to be safe, you need to go to round up to the next highest number. Even if it was 8.1, you would use 9. So notice that it's giving you just a bunch of different combinations, and in 1 that's, I believe, corners, and in 2 is face or edges, and NN3 is faces. So they're pretty similar. There's not a whole lot of variation here. And also, we've been using, we resampled everything when we normalized to 3 by 3 by 3 millimeters. So these are pretty big voxels. If you had something like a 2 by 2 by 2 resampling, which is entirely within, your choice, you would have cluster sizes which would be a lot bigger in order to pass correction, right? Because of a cluster of the same size, if you had smaller voxels, you need more to fill up that same cluster space.
So was our mask in our Atlas space or an M&I space?
Yeah, the mask was in M&I space.
Okay, and so then the data is in M&I space too?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
you don't have to calculate the volume?
No. Yeah, so everything's been standardized. We're working entirely within M&I space at this point.
When you go to report your thresholding then, like in a manuscript, would
Yeah.
you say you've corrected a 0.05, like whole grain 0.05?
Mm-hmm. With a cluster defining threshold of 0.001. Yeah. So you can check out all the other combinations, but I'm going to use a cluster size of 10 because I think 9.2 is probably the highest I'm going to get in any of these combinations. I mean, if you were on the border for something, let's say that you had a cluster of 8 and you I don't want to recommend going on a fishing expedition, but you could possibly justify that one of these combinations is more appropriate. My personal recommendation, find the one that's the most conservative and then use that just to protect yourself. Okay. Do you still have the AFNI viewer open somewhere in the background? Yeah? Okay, so now we know what cluster size we need to pass that threshold. So go back to your AFNI viewer. If you need all those individual windows, just click on Image again in each of these different things. Then we go to Clusterize. Okay, it's up here. Right here, Clusterize. NN level, that's similar to what we saw in the output before. I'm just going to leave that at 1 for now. And then for the voxels, this is going to threshold or map so that we only see voxels that are touching for that size or greater. So hit 10, press set, and it's eliminated some of the very, very small clusters. Now whatever remains in this map is a significant cluster. So we see things in the MPFC, some things in DLPFC, posterior parietal cortex. If you want a full report, like say something you'd put in the table of a manuscript, you click on Reports, which is right here. Everybody see that? And then you can jump around to these different clusters. You can flash to make sure that they're apparent. And yeah, so that cluster up there was about 44 voxels. Looks pretty good.
That was like, oh,
Yeah.
Do you use the AFNI where am I like coordinates or labeling system?
Do I use it?
Yeah, like is that how accurate is that? Or just
Oh, yeah. Good point. There is a command in AFNI called where am I you can run from the command line. It has a bunch of different functions. You can also run it on the fly within this graphical user interface. So I'm in MNI space, and if I right click on wherever my coordinates are, notice and hold it down, go to where am I, then release it. So where exactly was that cluster? And this will tell you using several different atlases. So for example, if I'm using, I should mainly just use the MNI atlas, not the Telluride atlas. You'll see a bunch of different ones. Let's see here. What's a good MNI atlas?
That's how many voxels you need to say that it's significant. So you need at least 8.5.
I would say something like,
But 8.9.
you know, I haven't looked at these in quite a while. CA. Probably this one. This is more like a probability map. I'm assuming using things like topologies, some other modalities maybe. This is my guess. And according to these labels, that would be in the left. Actually, I don't really like that. You know, for a lot of those, what I would recommend, the atlases that I prefer to use are actually in FSL, the Harvard-Oxford atlases. I haven't found a good way to port those into AFNI. They have a pretty well-supported Telluride-Tourneau atlas, but I haven't found a really good MNI atlas. Although we will be using those tomorrow to create regions of interest. Yeah. Another thing I like about the FSL atlases is they're probabilistic. So you can get like a kind of a gradient for what might be within that particular area. All right, so that is a whole brain analysis. That is the endpoint of a lot of analyses. Let's take a brief look at 3D MIMA. If you wanted to, again, be systematic about it, we would do 3D full with half max on the error time series for the Remel fit, because that's what we use as input for 3D MIMA. It's pretty much the same, not going to get too much into it, but let's just look at that and end with that for today as far as a demonstration. Okay. So let's close out of that, and then within this directory, oh, okay, you should be within, okay, find your group results directory, which should be in your home directory / group results, Flanker, I forget, somewhere in there. In any case, get to 3D t-test MIMA and then to test results. Hit the up arrow until you get to that copy command that you used to copy the MNI data set. If you do that from this directory, it should still be the same. So just keep scrolling up to get to that copy command and then press enter to copy the MNI template into that particular directory. Okay. Yeah. So we're just going to wrap up with this. Again, underlay the template, overlay the MIMA results. We're going to threshold it at the same, but realize that with the threshold, you now have different options. So you have the beta weights, you have P statistics, a couple other things I don't want you to pay attention to, but just threshold everything by those T statistics. Okay, uncorrected p-value. Remember, click on that box, set it to 0.001. Go to clusterize, set voxels to 10, set and apply, and then anything that survives that in your report is going to be statistically significant for a cluster. All right, who's totally sick of this and wants to get out of here? I don't blame you, okay? We are condensing a lot. We did go over time. At this point, you're free to remain. I'll be here for another, I don't know. Is it okay if I'm here for another half hour or so? If you have any questions, if there's anything else that you want to look at specifically in that proc file, any different commands you want to look at, please let me know, and we can mess around with things.
Oh, you have two surveys.
Oh, yeah.